They called her La Reina de la Radio, the voice that soothed a nation. But on a smoky morning in 1967, her microphone was cut. Her voice erased, her tapes burned, her name forbidden until now, because I'm her granddaughter, and I've come to tell you the story they tried to silence. The story of the woman who taught a generation to dream with their ears open. The story of how men with guns feared a woman with only words. Before I tell you how my grandmother changed history, let me tell you how she changed me. When I was 6 years old, my abuela Lucía María Estrella handed me a pair of headphones connected to a dusty cassette player. Her hands, weathered but elegant, trembled slightly as she pressed play. "This is forbidden," she whispered, looking over her shoulder, though we were alone in her apartment. "This is your inheritance." What came through those headphones wasn't just a voice. It was a revelation. Warm, velvety, like melted sugar and smoke. Strong, but intimate. As if she were speaking only to me, even as she addressed an entire nation. It was a love story about a woman who fell in love with her own freedom. A short one. A dangerous one. I didn't understand then why my grandmother's eyes filled with tears as I listened. Why she made me promise never to tell anyone about the tapes. I didn't understand that in our country, a woman's voice could be considered a weapon. That words could be more threatening than bullets. That remembering could be an act of revolution. But I understand now. And this is the story of how my grandmother's voice was stolen and how I helped her take it back. Lucía was born in Cartagena, Colombia, in 1938, with a voice that made people stop and listen. Even as a baby, she didn't cry like other children, my great-grandmother once told me. She sang her demands, made music of her pain. She was the eldest of 9 children in a family where food was scarce, but stories were plentiful. Her father was a fisherman who returned each night with nets full of silver fish and tales of the sea. Her mother was a laundress who hummed boleros while wringing clothes, her strong hands turning each piece like she was coaxing music from the fabric itself. They couldn't afford books, so Lucía learned to read from discarded newspapers she collected from the houses where her mother worked. By 6, she could read better than children twice her age. By 10, she was writing poems that made her teachers whisper behind their hands. "That girl has dangerous ideas," they said. What they meant was, she has ideas at all. In school, she was taught that women were meant to be silent. To be good was to be quiet. To be respected was to be unseen. Girls who spoke too loudly were made to stand in corners. Girls who questioned were sent home. Lucía spent a lot of time in corners. "But I discovered something in those corners," she told me once. "I discovered that from the margins, you see everything. You hear everything. While they think you're being punished, you're really gathering ammunition." She discovered radio by accident. One afternoon, while delivering clean clothes to the mayor's wife, she walked past the local station and heard the host reading a poem she had written anonymously for a school contest. Her poem, her words, in a man's voice, traveling through the air to countless ears. She stood outside that station for 3 hours, hoping to hear it again. Not because she wanted credit, but because she wanted to understand the magic. How could her whispered thoughts become so amplified? How could her private dreams enter strangers' homes? At 16, she was knocking on the radio station's door, offering to read the news. The men laughed. A girl? On air? What next? A female president? But then the receptionist fell ill. And Lucía, who had been bringing coffee to the station manager for weeks, was the only one who knew how to type. "Just for today," they said. "Just to announce the weather and lost pets." Her voice stunned them into silence. By 18, she had her own late-night show. Voces de Medianoche, Voices of Midnight. A woman's voice, traveling across the airwaves while the country slept. A woman's thoughts, entering homes where women weren't permitted opinions. A woman's questions, planting seeds in a landscape of certainty. It was revolutionary simply because it existed. Lucía didn't just report the news, she transformed it. While other hosts read government-approved scripts about development projects and military victories, she slipped in poetry between announcements. She read letters from farmers whose land had been seized, from workers whose strikes had been crushed, from mothers whose sons had disappeared in the night. She made midnight feel sacred, a time when truth could be spoken without fear, when pain could be acknowledged without shame. Women, especially, wrote to her by the hundreds. "Lucia," they wrote on the thin paper with careful handwriting, "you speak at the things we dare not say, even to ourselves." Young girls saved their allowance to buy batteries for hidden radios. Wives waited until their husbands slept to tune in. Elderly women who had never been permitted to learn to read found in her voice a literacy they'd been denied. They called her La Reina de la Radio, the radio queen. She didn't want the crown, but she wore it with pride. "I'm not special," she would say at the beginning of each broadcast. "I'm just saying out loud what you already know in your hearts." But that was precisely what made her dangerous. In 1965, a new military government took power. Men with pressed uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. Men who spoke of order, tradition, and proper roles. Men who believed a woman's highest calling was silent obedience. They didn't like women speaking freely. They especially didn't like women asking questions. The first warning came after Lucía interviewed a widowed mother whose land had been taken for a government project. No compensation, no alternatives. Just soldiers arriving one morning with papers she couldn't read and guns she understood perfectly. The station manager received a phone call. "Control your girl," they said, "or we will." The second warning came when she read a poem by a dissident writer who had been imprisoned, then exiled. She didn't mention his politics, just his words about longing for home. That time, they sent police to the station. "The next time," they said, examining their fingernails, "we won't be so polite." Lucía smiled demurely, lowered her eyes as she'd been taught, then played Chopin's revolutionary etude as they walked out. Her colleagues begged her to be careful, to play more music, ask fewer questions, to remember that radio stations could be closed, transmitters confiscated, broadcasting licenses revoked. "What about our jobs?" they asked. "What about our families?" She understood their fear. She felt it too, a cold weight in her stomach each time she opened the microphone. But she also felt the weight of all those letters, all those women listening in the dark. "If I stop speaking," she told her producer, "who will speak for them?" It was July 3rd, 1967, a Tuesday, unusually hot for the season. Lucía arrived at the station earlier than usual, a stack of letters in her worn leather bag. One had been slipped under her door that morning. No return address. Handwriting shaky with fear, or perhaps age. It told the story of a boy, 17 years old, a student who had participated in a peaceful protest against the closure of his university, taken from his home in the middle of the night. No charges, no trial, just disappeared. His mother had gone to the police, to the military headquarters, to the newspapers. No one would help. No one would even acknowledge he existed. "Please," the letter ended. "My son's name is Miguel Ángel Soto. Say his name so he is not forgotten." Lucía opened her show as she always did, with the soft tones of a piano and her signature greeting. "Buenas noches, mi gente bonita. It's midnight, and the truth has no curfew." She read the weather report, the upcoming festival announcements, a birth notice from a prominent family. Then, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper, she began to tell the story of Miguel Ángel Soto and his mother's search. "If you know where he is," she said, her voice steady despite the terror fluttering in her chest, "call me. If you're afraid to speak, write me. If you are listening and you have power, use it to bring him home." The studio door burst open. Men in uniform. No warning, no pretense of civility. "Cut her off," one ordered the technician. Lucía kept speaking, her voice rising. "We cannot be a country where sons vanish and mothers are left to—" The line went dead. Mid-sentence. Mid-truth. She was dragged from her chair, her script scattered across the floor. Her producer tried to intervene and was struck with the butt of a rifle. The technician stared at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. That night, her tapes were seized. Her voice, the voice of thousands, was buried under military silence. My grandmother was given a choice that wasn't really a choice: leave or disappear. She fled to Ecuador under a false name, Elena Vega, a quiet widow with no past. She became a primary school teacher, taught history, taught silence, never used a microphone again. She met my grandfather there, a kind man who knew nothing of La Reina de la Radio, who loved her for her quiet strength, never knowing the thunderous power she had once wielded. She raised my mother in whispers, in the language of caution, in the belief that safety came from invisibility. "Never shine too brightly," she would tell my mother. "Never speak too loudly." When I was born, she didn't speak of the radio, of her past glory, of the thousands who had once listened for her voice in the dark. She was Elena Vega now. Elena Vega she would remain, until I found the tapes. The basement full of ghosts. I was 22 when I discovered the box marked Vinilos in her basement. Home from university for the summer, I had been tasked with clearing out the storage room. Decades of accumulated life, dusty furniture, photo albums, Christmas decorations never unpacked. And then, that box, heavy with secrets. Inside, cassette tapes, their labels faded but still legible. Handwritten scripts, the ink blurred on thin paper. Yellowed fan letters tied with blue ribbon. A silver microphone, small enough to fit in a palm, engraved with her initials, LME. I didn't understand what I was seeing. My grandmother, my quiet, cautious grandmother, who flinched at loud noises and avoided crowds, had been someone else entirely. I took one of the tapes upstairs and found her old cassette player. When her voice filled the room, commanding, passionate, unafraid, I didn't recognize it as hers. She found me there, sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by evidence of her former life. Her face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she reached for the player, shutting it off mid-sentence. "Where did you find those?" she whispered. "Who are you?" I asked in return. We stared at each other across a gulf of silence and secrets. Then she sat down beside me, took my hand in hers, and began to tell me everything. How she had once been a voice for the voiceless. How men with guns had feared her words enough to silence them. How she had saved these tapes, smuggled them out when she fled, hidden them for decades, not out of vanity, but as evidence. Proof that she had existed, that she had mattered. One letter from the box read, "Mi Reina, I named my daughter after you. One day she will hear your voice and know what a woman can be." I cried. I asked her, "Why did you stop? Why didn't you find another station, another country? Why did you let them win?" She was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the outline of the microphone. "Because they made me believe I was alone, that no one was listening anymore, that my words had been forgotten." Then she looked me in the eyes and added, "But maybe now someone will." Reclaiming her voice. I was a journalism student with a laptop and a passion for forgotten stories. I had no money, no connections, no influence. But I had her tapes, I had her letters, I had her truth. I started a podcast called Midnight Belongs to Her. Each episode began with her voice, that warm, velvety voice that had once commanded the airwaves, and her signature sign-off, No estás sola, nunca lo estuviste. You are not alone, you never were. I interviewed her for hours about the story she had told, the people she had amplified, the truth she had insisted on speaking even as the world tried to silence it. I researched the cases she had covered, the disappeared students, the widowed mothers, the silenced artists. Where were they now? What had become of their struggles? Had anything changed? The podcast was slow to find an audience. 3 listeners, then 30, then 300. Then something extraordinary happened. Women began to write in. Elderly women who remembered listening under their blankets as girls. Middle-aged women whose mothers had spoken of La Reina as if she were a mythical figure. Young women discovering for the first time that their struggles weren't new, that their voices had ancestors. I remember her. She helped me survive. My mother used to listen to her while braiding my hair. I thought she was just a legend. The stories poured in about how her broadcast had been the only truth in a landscape of lies. About how her voice had given courage to women who had been taught that courage wasn't feminine. About how her sudden silence had left a wound that never fully healed. We learned that Miguel Ángel Soto, the disappeared boy from her final broadcast, had indeed been killed. But his mother had never stopped searching, never stopped speaking his name. She was still alive, living in a small apartment filled with his photographs, still waiting for justice that never came. We interviewed her for the podcast. She wept when she heard my grandmother's voice speaking her son's name after all these years. They silenced her, she said, but they couldn't silence the truth. It just took longer to be heard. 2 months after my podcast hit 500,000 plays, I received an email from the Ministry of Culture. Times had changed, they said. Democracy had returned. The government wished to make amends for past wrongs. They had found archived records proving Lucía had been systematically monitored, reports of her broadcasts, transcripts of her shows, orders for her censorship signed by men now celebrated as national heroes. They offered to restore her tapes, place them in the National Museum, to honor her as a cultural treasure, to officially apologize for her silencing. My grandmother refused. They didn't want my voice then. Let the people keep it now. So we released it all, free and online, every tape we had, every script, every letter, an entire generation of silenced stories, resurrected. Women organized listening circles. Daughters played the broadcasts for mothers who had once listened in secret. University students analyzed her techniques, her courage, her impact. Her voice, once forbidden, now echoed from phones, computers, car speakers, and classroom projectors. The men who had silenced her were mostly dead now. Their power turned to dust, their orders relegated to shameful footnotes in history books. But her voice lived on. My grandmother lived long enough to see her voice reclaimed, to hear young women quoting her words at protests, to see her name in textbooks and academic papers. Before she passed, she asked me to record her one last time. Not for fame, not for justice, for closure. She sat in my small home studio, adjusting the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had once lived behind one. At 84, her voice had aged into something deeper, rougher, but no less powerful. She spoke directly to the new generation, about the price of silence, about the courage it takes to speak truth, about how power fears nothing more than a woman who refuses to be silenced. Then she smiled and said, If they wanted silence, they chose the wrong woman. I was born speaking. And my voice? It was never just mine. She smiled, a glimpse of the fierce young woman she had once been shining through her aged face. It was always ours. Today I sit in the same chair she once used for that final recording, continuing her legacy through this channel. If my grandmother's story moved you, if you understand what it means for a woman's voice to be silenced, here's how you can keep her echo alive. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of women who refuse to be silenced. Next week, I'll share the story of the journalist who documented 300 disappeared women while hiding her own identity for 2 decades. Share this video with the women in your life who need to know they're not alone. Your mother, your daughter, your friend who's been told to speak more softly. Leave a comment telling us about a woman whose voice changed your life. Your grandmother, your teacher, or maybe even yourself. Because legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we pass forward, on air, in blood, and in truth. My grandmother taught me that a woman with a voice is, by definition, a dangerous woman. Dangerous to injustice. Dangerous to oppression. Dangerous to lies. And in a world still trying to silence women, being dangerous might be the most important thing we can be. Remember her words that close every episode. No estás sola. Nunca lo estuviste. You are not alone. You never were. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that history tried to erase. Because every time you listen, another silenced voice finds its echo. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.